Okay. And now we begin. So, thank you very much for coming to the, by my numbering, 240th GBD event. It's great to see all of you here. And I'm Judge Morris with the Global Business Dialogue, and just a few very brief things to say, starting as always with thank you. Especially grateful to the EU, to Damien Levy, who we've been working with for a long time. But basically, I want to say the EU writ large, because over the years they've been, since we started, very helpful to the Global Business Dialogue. Though I think this is the first time that we've had an ambassador from the European Union with us, so that's a real special treat. I also, while we don't have sponsors for this event specifically, and I mention that because we'll actually be going to you more frequently in the future seeking a specific event sponsors, but we wouldn't be possible without A, members, and B, sponsors. And two of them are the GBD's main sponsors are here today. It's Steptoe & Johnson with Dick Cunningham in the back there, and Mr. Don Brasher, the only individual who's actually a sponsor, been a great help for over the years. I also wanted to just note that we'll see we didn't give you a giant sheaf of papers this time around. We just did that little 4-page handout, and I think that's the system we'll use in the future, but we will post online, certainly by Monday, if not before, full bios of all speakers. I would say full to the extent that we have them. We're not going to give you their birth certificate. But anyway, we'll do the full participants list, and we'll tell you that this is up on YouTube, which is certainly what I expect the case will be. One of the people you're going to see a couple of times today is Michaela Chen, Michaela Moranova Chen, who was for some time with the Commission. Even before that, she actually, I don't like to use WIDA's name in this organization, but when I first met her, she was with WIDA. She's been a pillar of strength for every organization she's served in, and to all the people that she's come in contact with. She's now at Boston Scientific, but as most of you know, was for many years with the EU, and she will introduce the ambassador. I'm just very grateful that she's part of this organization and willing to help. Michaela?
Thank you, Judge, and thank you all for coming today. First, before I introduce the ambassador, I will return the favor and thank Judge. I think he always puts together fantastic events, and this is no exception. I think the timing is particularly good in this case. As Judge mentioned, I work for Boston Scientific, which is a medical device manufacturer in presence in about 100 countries, and substantial manufacturing in Ireland, where the ambassador is from. Before I get into the ambassador's biography, I would like to mention, as Judge said, that I used to work for the EU, so I had the privilege of working with the ambassador. And he's really extraordinary in the way that he is not just a fantastic diplomat and knows when to push the issues at the right time and with the right push. And I think I would defer everyone to read the trade deficit submission of the EU, which I think really tells a lot. And I think it's a masterpiece in its own sense of diplomacy. But he's also excellent at kind of technical details. He's one of those bosses that you go to brief for 45 minutes and then you leave realizing that you still know way less about the issue that you're supposed to be following than he does. So that's why he's where he is and we are where we are. But with that, for the background, the ambassador started in 2014 as the ambassador to the US. Before that, he served as the CIO of the External Action Service, establishing it under Cathy Ashton. He also served as the head of the cabinet of President Prodi. He also served as Secretary General. Also, as many of you know, Director of DG Trade, Director General of DG Trade. And for those who still remember Doha, he was a chief negotiator of the Doha for the EU. So I could go into the other positions that he's held since 1979 with the Commission. But I think I would like to just highlight first that he was a winner of the Irish Times debate competition in college. So you can do Q&A and test him on that. And for those who are feeling very good about listening to the Rosetta Stone tapes on the way to work, I think I'll crush your ego just by telling you that the ambassador is fluent in English, of course, Irish, French, German, Spanish, and Japanese. So that took me a long time just to remember that, but that's your goal for 2018. Thomas Edison said that opportunity is lost on most people because it's dressed in overalls and requires a lot of work. I don't suggest that the ambassador wears overalls, although rompers have been particularly trendy lately. But I think the opportunity is here for the EU. With the new French President Macron, I think we are seeing really a new wave of enthusiasm for the EU, how it could be reformed, what the opportunities lie. Also, there is Brexit, but I think viewing it as a negative at this point, I think whole Europe is, again, using it as an opportunity to see how the EU can change and how it can address some of these issues. I specifically liked how the President Macron had mentioned that he would like to see the EU that protects. And the reason why I mention it, not because, we've seen protectionism around the world, but I think it's trying to address what was at the heart of the opposition to globalization and trade policy, and that's the fear that the people are not protected from all the changes, whether it's technological change or globalization. And I think once that's addressed, I think it's going to make it easier for us to, again, pursue some of the multilateral, perhaps, trade deals. So with that, I'd like to welcome the ambassador. Thank you for joining us, and I look forward to your remarks.
Well, thank you very much, Michaela. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Great pleasure to be here at the Global Business Dialogue on your gavel day, as I understand it. So good luck to the new advisory board. And of course, I'm often introduced by people when I speak at these events, but it's a particular pleasure to have been introduced by Michaela, who was such a wonderful official in the European Union delegation and who did an excellent job. And I can assure you that I rarely had the impression when she left the room that I knew more than she did about the subject. Trade doesn't get a great press these days, but I continue to believe that it is probably the single most important driver of prosperity and wealth creation in all our societies, and as a vehicle for the social and economic progress, which ultimately has to be the purpose of public policy. I often like to say at events like this that I think we Europeans pretty much invented trade. I think that's probably true. And I think that it very much is in our DNA to believe in trade, to understand the benefits of trade. And it was therefore not surprising that after the two cataclysmic European civil wars, which turned into global conflicts in the 20th century, that when we talked about developing a new business model for Europe, after several attempts to get that off the ground in one way or another, we finally turned to trade as the main vehicle for relaunching a new way of doing business in Europe. And that was, of course, the Treaty of Rome in 1957, signed by 6 countries, designed to create what was called a common market. The rest, as we know, is history. We are now 28 member states, perhaps in 18 months from now to be 27 again, but we're 28. And we have built one of the largest economies in the world. When I first arrived here, and the exchange rate was in a slightly different state, I used to be able to joke that we were the largest economy, and when America and China fought over which of their economies was the biggest, you were fighting for second and third place. I think it's kind of changed a bit, though I notice the exchange rate is changing again, so who knows. But anyway, we're one of the 3 largest economies in the world, along with the US and China. And we are the largest trading bloc. We are the second biggest exporter of goods after China, and the second largest importer after the United States. We're the largest importer and exporter of services. Every 1 billion euros of European exports creates up to 14,000 new jobs. And not only are we the top destination for foreign direct investment, but we're also the biggest source of foreign direct investment. And the United States is the EU's biggest destination for investment. 80% of foreign direct investment in this country comes from the European Union. We are also, and I think it's important to underline this, the main market for developing economies, including, and this may come as a surprise to some of you, for agricultural products, where the European Union market is an extremely important outlet for the developing world. And we are the only major trading bloc which offers full duty-free and quota-free access to our economy for least developed countries. There are other countries around the world that do that, but we are the only one of the major trading blocs that actually does that, and it's been a very important sign of the extent to which we believe that trade should not only benefit ourselves, but that it should also benefit the less well-off countries of the world, for whom trade is clearly a path towards greater prosperity, towards greater stability, and towards greater political security. And we should never forget in the trade debate that the fact that other countries gain from trade, as they do, is not a loss for the rest of us. They become more wealthy, they buy better products, and the fact that we lift people out of poverty, or that we enable countries to become more stable or more secure, is a public good, which is imminently in our collective interest in trying to manage the very unstable world through which we live. And trade does not just promote trade and economics, it also helps us promote our values. We're able to encourage countries around the world to effect change to human rights for the better. We influence good governance. And when negotiating trade agreements, we try to enshrine internationally recognized standards on environment and labor rights. But as Michaela said, and I think we have to acknowledge it, there is in Europe, as here in the United States, a growing sense of disenchantment with the full benefits of trade. And I think we have to listen to those concerns. But I do think that we also need to frame that debate correctly. In my view, people have not been left behind by globalization. They've been left behind by the failure of public policy to address some of the consequences of globalization. And that is the real challenge. So you cannot put the genie back in the bottle, in my view. It is not, the way forward is not to go backwards and say, well, if we hadn't had this globalization, everything would be fine, because we know it wouldn't be. The example I sometimes like to cite is in Europe, which I lived through in the 80s, when we were pouring billions and billions of what we then called ECUs into the steel and shipbuilding industry, only to find that 5 years later, much of those factories had closed, much of those jobs went. If we had put that money into R&D, innovation, training, regional investment to provide alternative employment, it would have been much better spent. And I think that's a lesson that we should not forget. So I'm by no means dismissing the concerns of regions or people who feel displaced by globalization, by trade, by technological change, which, by the way, I think risks to become an even bigger disruptor than trade and globalization have been. I do not in any way dismiss or diminish the concerns of those people, but I think we have to find the right public response, public policy response. And I respectfully suggest that that is not less trade, less international exchanges. It is rather to be found in how we address the concerns of people through education, training, regional development, the capacity to invest in areas which may suddenly find themselves affected by the closure of a factory or an important source of employment. That is how we help people. And I do think that one of the big failings of the last 20 years or so has been, less in Europe than here, but still a problem in Europe, has been the issue of rising inequality. And that is something which, quite frankly, requires a public policy response, and it's not something which will be solved through trade policy solutions. So I think we have to acknowledge that this problem is there, and the European Commission, which recently is publishing a series of papers on the future of Europe and how we go forward at 27 after Brexit, has included in one of the accompanying papers a paper on harnessing globalization. And I really commend it to your reading, because I think it is an excellent attempt to more or less say what I've just said, or maybe I'm saying what was in the paper. But it really puts the emphasis on a constructive response to the challenges of globalization and the social and economic consequences, but which involves going with the grain of globalization rather than trying to turn back the tide. And of course, we also are strong advocates of fair trade. We understand that the international playing field is not always fully level, and playing by the rules is important. And we have been a strong supporter of the WTO. We continue to believe that having a rules-based trading system is in everyone's best interest. Sometimes it comes out in your favor, sometimes it doesn't. But having a system and a structure and a procedure through which the rules of international trade are managed and ultimately adjudicated is for us an indispensable part of making that system work in the best interests of us all. Now, we are, notwithstanding the fact that trade has had its difficulties in Europe, I think it's sometimes not fully understood here in the United States, nonetheless, just how far we are actually progressing with our trade agenda, and particularly Cecilia Malmström as the Commissioner for Trade has to be one of the busiest members of the European Commission at the present time. Last year we concluded the EU-Canada Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, which has been ratified by the Council of the European Union and the European Parliament and will enter into provisional application quite soon. It is probably the most ambitious and the most comprehensive trade deal we've ever concluded with a fellow developed country. And I think it will be a model for what we will try to do with similar economies. We have concluded negotiations with Vietnam, and following our complicated need to translate all of these agreements into 23 languages, that will come up for ratification soon. We're also going to be able to ratify soon the agreement with Singapore, which we concluded a few years ago, but which was referred to the Court of Justice to arbitrate the rules about to what extent trade agreements are a matter of exclusive European competence, or they are shared with member states and therefore requiring national ratification. I just draw to your attention also, I'm sure, as trade aficionados, you've all read the court judgment. There's a very important judgment of the court, which frankly, I mean, I'm not a lawyer, and the legal eagles of the Commission are studying it all, so I have to be careful what I say. But my reading as a former Director General of Trade is that this was a pretty important step forward in underlining that the vast bulk of what we put in trade agreements is in fact the exclusive competence of the European Union, therefore requiring ratification by the Council of Ministers and by the European Parliament, but not national ratification. There are a couple of areas, notably in the investment field, which the court continues to believe would be of national mixed competence, and the European Commission is going to have to figure out how that impacts on the way we craft our trade deals. But basically the court has confirmed the views of the European Commission down many years that the vast bulk of what we put in trade deals is in fact exclusive competence and should not normally require ratification at national level. Talks with Mexico and Japan are accelerating. We have a free trade agreement with Mexico, but it's a first generation trade deal from the turn of the century. We're upgrading it, and that is moving very well. We are engaged and have been for several years with Japan, and I understand that it is likely that we will make progress on that deal in the coming months. We are also engaged with Mercosur, which was going well, but some of the political complications in the region may slow it down a little. And we will soon launch negotiations with Chile, which is a bit like Mexico, where we have a first generation trade agreement which needs to be upgraded, with Australia and New Zealand. And I must say I'm particularly pleased to have played my role in promoting the notion that we could do a free trade deal with Australia and New Zealand, which was something a few years ago in Brussels was thought of unimaginable, and we have now crossed that Rubicon. And we're also progressing in our bilateral investment treaty negotiations with China and with Myanmar, Burma. And we're seeing additional interest from the ASEAN region particularly Indonesia, and we've always had the ambition to conclude a region-to-region agreement with ASEAN. We started out trying to do that in the beginning, then we got into difficulties over Burma, Myanmar, which was a political problem, so we then went down the bilateral track, but we've always had a commitment that as we put together a package of deals with bilateral deals with the individual countries of Myanmar, we would try to bring this together in an overarching region-to-region agreement, and that is still very much on the agenda. So in all of this, basically what I want you to understand is that when Cecilia Malmström finishes her mandate in November 2019, and if she brings home all of these deals, which I have no doubt she will, Europe will be at the center of the world's largest free trading network the world has ever seen. And that is the direction in which we are moving, and we may not get every deal done in that time frame, but that is our objective. And you need to understand that notwithstanding the debate about trade, there is a very strong public and popular support in Europe for moving in that direction. There are caveats. There will be, as always, 3 steps forward, 2 steps back. But the direction of travel is clear, and there is a very strong consensus, both in the Council of Ministers and in the European Parliament, to go in that direction. Now, where does this leave us with the United States? Well, as you know, actually the relationship with the United States is our single most important economic relationship. We are the most integrated partners in the world. The transatlantic corridor is the economic corridor, is the single most important economic corridor in the world, bar none. We are both more heavily invested in trade and FDI with each other than either of us are with any other partner, either in Asia or anywhere else. We believe that this relationship is a win-win relationship. It offers huge opportunities. And just let me remind you of some of the figures that underpin that. Together, we would have a combined market of 830 million consumers. We account for roughly 50% of world GDP and 1/3 of world trade. The transatlantic economy generates $5.5 trillion in total commercial sales a year. And we estimate that exports from the United States to Europe generate over 2.5 million jobs in the US, and in total some 15 million jobs on both sides of the Atlantic depend on mutual trade. As I said earlier, our FDI presence here is enormous. European firms employ 2/3 of all US workers on the payroll of majority-owned foreign affiliates. For example, BMW Group is the largest automotive exporter by value from the US, something which is not always acknowledged. BMW and Daimler own 265 plants and have created 110,000 jobs in the US, and half of these depended on the export business. So this is a hugely interdependent economic relationship. But it is also true that there are elements in that relationship that could benefit from a comprehensive and balanced trade deal between us, and that was the logic of the TTIP negotiation. Firstly, to get rid of the tariff issues. There are not huge tariff issues, but they're there. And it would be good to move to virtual elimination of tariffs where possible. Then there's the whole regulatory component, where I know there are lots of problems for business. The sort of duplication in our regulatory systems is often not necessary to maintain the high standards which we wish to achieve. And the work we have done in TTIP clearly identified a lot of ways in which we could reduce the cost of doing business across the Atlantic without undermining in any way either the autonomy of our regulators, and we both understand that our regulators are attached to their autonomy, so either their autonomy or the high standards that we both seek to achieve through those regulations. But we could frankly show much more trust and confidence in mutual recognition of systems which would reduce costs in considerable ways. So we entered into the negotiations in July 2013. We made a lot of progress. A lot of texts were developed, but frankly, we weren't able to conclude this in the back end of last year. And there certainly were some issues which we have to address. And I think now with the new administration, and we have to be honest, this is a new administration which clearly is looking for some kind of a paradigm shift in the trade field, so we need to try and understand that. To be frank, there are things which concern us in what is being said. A strong concentration on the issue of bilateral deficits or deficits and surpluses, in my view, is not the best way to address the issue of trade. Excuse me for those of you who've heard this before, but the only trade joke I know was taught to me by my international economics lecturer in Trinity College in Dublin, who spoke of a trade minister who was sent to Geneva to a meeting of the GATT, as it then was, and he was asked to propose the toast at dinner, and he said, "I'd like to propose a toast to the day when we can all have healthy trade surpluses." Clearly he was talking about trading with the moon or Mars. But you get my point. I mean, I understand that if there are reasons why, if people are reason to be concerned about a surplus or a deficit, if they have reason to believe that there are obstacles, that there are unfair practices which are at the origin of that, then that, of course, is a very legitimate cause of concern. But the simple existence of a deficit or a surplus doesn't tell you very much about the benefits and the advantages of an open trading relationship based on a level playing field. So we worry about that. We worry about the current investigation into steel under the national security clause of Article 232, which we find is perhaps not the best way to address some of the issues which are being discussed. We wait to see what will emerge from the report, which we're told is due out in a few weeks, as there will be also a report on the deficit issue. So we are trying to understand how this new administration sees the trade agenda. Ambassador Lighthizer has just been confirmed and was in a hearing yesterday and had a first meeting, a productive and useful meeting with Cecilia Malmström 2 weeks ago in Paris. So we're at very early stages. When President Trump visited the European institutions in May 25th when he was in Brussels for the NATO summit, he had a good conversation with President Juncker, President Tusk, and we have agreed some follow-up to start exchanging views on issues of common concern, including, frankly, the issue of overcapacity, particularly in the steel and aluminium sector, the issue of non-market economy status for China, and some of the other issues which we have with China, which are shared and common to us all. So I think we will be able to have those conversations. Whether we can restart our negotiations, I think, is something that we need to evaluate in function of those conversations. We need to see what our objectives would be, how we would address some of the problems, and frankly, these are not one of the problems I have in mind. For example, the issue of government procurement was a stumbling block with the last administration, so it's not an administration issue, it's a real issue, and I don't know if we would be able to make progress, for example, in that area. And I think what Cecilia Malmström has been saying is, let us only restart the negotiations if we are clearly in a position to believe that they are likely to succeed. So we need some prior discussions about those elements. But I want to emphasize that we are, as I think I've been illustrating this morning, fully committed to global trade and ready to engage in any conversation, particularly with our closest partner, the United States, on how we can address concerns that may exist about the level playing field, about the global trading rules, in order to see if concerns can be addressed or we can have common action or shared views. And it is in that spirit that we will go forward with the new administration. And I know that Cecilia Malmström looks forward very much to working with Ambassador Lighthizer, and we will certainly take up the commitment, take it in Brussels with President Trump to have a constructive dialogue on those issues. That's what I would like to say this morning. It's great to be here. Thank you very much for the opportunity to address you, and I think we're going to have some questions and answers.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Yeah, so if you have a question, if you could just wait for the mic, and once the mic arrives, if you could introduce yourself so the ambassador knows who he's talking to. There was David, were you?
Morning, Mr. Ambassador. Dave Salmonson with the American Farm Bureau. Trying to reflect back from last year to this and the political scenery around trade. Whereas last year we had a lot of political conversation in the U.S. during the campaign on NAFTA, while in Europe there was a lot of, I'll just call it political conversation about TTIP, some of which went into the streets with some very inventive signs and balloons and other things. And if we're looking forward to try to get back to negotiations, do you see movement, or how will the people in favor of TTIP address some of the issues that were brought up in Europe last year?
Well, you're right that TTIP did provoke a level of public interest in a trade negotiation that I'd never seen before. I mean, frankly, sometimes it was difficult to get people interested in trade negotiations. And let's face it, for those of us who practice the art, it's pretty boring. And I think one of the things that shocked the civil society groups who wanted access to the proceedings when Cecilia Malmström took the admittedly courageous decision, and frankly, as a former trade negotiator, I was a bit hesitant about, putting all this stuff out there, though I think she's absolutely right, and frankly, I think there is no other way these days to deal with these issues than to put it all out there. And let's be honest, the so-called secrecy of the negotiation is pretty limited anyway. But when people actually saw what we were doing, they were kind of a bit shocked and bored, and at one stage, not only that, they said, yeah, you're showing us the text, but now could you tell us what it means? So then we had to write explanations of what the thing was about, and they still said, yeah, but you're still not telling us the whole truth. And we were like, no, I'm afraid we are, actually. It is as boring as it looks. But TTIP did provoke a fairly massive popular reaction, and as you know, it was also around a subject that, frankly, I sort of hadn't realized existed until I happened to get into the sort of arcane elements of the Lisbon Treaty, which is investor-state dispute settlement, which again was a subject I now know more about than I ever thought I would need to. So we did have that popular reaction, but I want to emphasize that to a certain extent the discussion about the CETA agreement became a sort of proxy for that, and many of the people who had mobilized against TTIP tried to mobilize against CETA. And frankly, the argument was won. I mean, we succeeded. We tested the patience of our Canadian partners to near destruction, I would say, but they were very patient, and we managed to get this across the line. And I think it's that, the reaction here in America was very much, oh, look at all the problems you had about CETA. I said, well, actually, the reaction should be, we got CETA across the line. We ratified it, and we will implement it, and it will be a successful agreement for both parties. And that's the news out of the CETA debate. And I think that reflects the feelings of Europeans about trade than the sort of people on the streets about TTIP, which is an agreement which doesn't even exist, let's be honest. I mean, when people used to say to me, I'm completely opposed to TTIP, I say, well, which TTIP are you talking about? And then they would be the one that will force feed GMOs to our babies, and et cetera, et cetera. And I would say, well, yeah, that's great. I'm against that TTIP too. So we're agreed, right? So I think the mood has changed in Europe. By the way, the economic mood is also more buoyant now, which is always helpful. So I think if we were to restart negotiations, of course we'd have to be clear about what we were trying to achieve. And what were the prospects for success. And we would probably still have some opposition, but I think the general mood in Europe still recognizes that well-crafted and balanced trade deals are a huge plus to the economy and also to our people.
You were second? Go for it. Yeah.
Brett Fordham from Inside U.S. Trade. Commerce Secretary Ross said a couple weeks ago, he mentioned the possibility of smaller outcomes before a larger U.S.-EU trade deal comes to fruition. What type, I know you mentioned the regulatory sector and the pharmaceutical deal, what was done between the FDA and the EU member state agencies and the EMA. But are there other outcomes you see as possible before TTIP or TTIP by another name would actually come to fruition, just smaller deals, such as an autos or something?
Look, I think that's an open question. I heard what the Secretary said, but frankly, we have not gone into any detail on this. And that's why I said that what was agreed with President Trump and President Juncker was that we would get people together to look at all these issues. And I understand that it's Ambassador Lighthizer on the US side and Cecilia Malmström on the EU side who will take forward those discussions. And let's see. I mean, you know, it takes you into the issue of the single undertaking, the extent to which it's better to try and put everything into one big negotiation, or do you try to do sort of individual bits and pieces? Sometimes it's easier, sometimes it's more complicated. And frankly, I think we need to reflect on how we can best move forward. I mean, I think we have so many common interests that we should not let the best be the enemy of the good. But on the other hand, we also want to make sure that if we can restart negotiations, that there is a good prospect of success.
Dick Cunningham, Steptoe and Johnson. Mr. Ambassador, there's a lot of talk about there's differences in approach and differences of interest between the U.S. administration today and Europe. One area where, in many ways, you're on the same wavelength is China, both in terms of China non-market economy issue in the anti-dumping area, but also on what I think is the big issue in China, which is overcapacity in some of the big industries that are import sensitive, both in here and in Europe. And I've had one administration person tell me that if they saw a way through to seriously address Chinese overcapacity, then we might not be having these Section 232 cases, because steel and aluminum are both China overcapacity problems, basically. Semiconductor, which looks like the next one, appears to be anticipating a big Chinese increase in capacity in 2018. Is there any hope? Is there any way to get to Chinese overcapacity? I know we've been negotiating, we've been having G20 and G7 statements, which they sign on to, but it doesn't seem to happen. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I'm not privy to the negotiations, but what I can say is that this was very much part of the discussion between President Trump and President Juncker, and we made very clear that we share the concerns, and we are very willing to work in partnership with the US to see how we can put more pressure on China to address that issue. We have exactly the same concerns. And we are one of the things I hope that can now happen as a result of the dialogue which will start is this will be one of the areas which we can work on. You also mentioned the non-market economy status. That's also a concern for us. We also have a case in Geneva, and we want to work very closely with the US in order to preserve our ability to intervene in situations where there has been excessive state intervention in an economic sector, which is, I think, the key fact in terms of preserving how our anti-dumping and other trade defense instruments work. And we have a shared concern there. So we're very open to that discussion. I'm certainly not going to publicly now speculate on exactly what methods could be used, but I think between the United States and the EU, we're pretty good at being creative in these areas if we want to apply our minds to it.
Judge, and then
Thanks, Michaela. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. It was a really great speech, and we're very honored that it was given here. I was impressed by your comments about the breadth of the EU's trade negotiations. And I hate to be the skunk of the garden party, but I have to ask if there is any sense of a Brexit complication to any of those negotiations. In other words, does the Brexit issue enter into negotiations with third countries when you're talking about the future? And then the second component of that is if you could comment at all on the trade component of the Brexit talks, that would be helpful.
Well, I mean, Brexit is going to complicate it for the UK because they're going to exit. I don't know how many hundred trade deals that we have. I saw Financial Times, I think, had a figure, which I don't know. Well, anyway, it's a very large number of trade deals. Even I was impressed. I had no idea the number was quite that large. And so the UK is going to have to reinvent, assuming it leaves the customs union, leaves the single market, then it's going to have to reinvent all those relationships, and that's going to be quite a complicated challenge for the UK. For us, no, because our trade deals continue, and simply we airbrush the UK out out of the treaty. So that's the practicalities. In terms of negotiating, of course, we regret the departure of the UK, and it is a significant economy, but I just would point out that, you know, even with the UK leaving, we're still, you know, 445 million people, 15, 16 trillion euro economy, depending on, you know, which day you count it on. So I think we're still going to be a very interesting trade partner for everyone. On the trade aspects of the Brexit negotiations, look, I'm not privy at all to those discussions, and anyway, they've only started. I mean, what I understand is that the current position of the British government is to wish to replace their membership of the single market and the customs union with a bespoke FTA negotiated between the UK and the EU. That is going to take time. I mean, recreating elements of the membership of the single market and the customs union through a trade deal that's going to be a big negotiation, a complex negotiation. So I think that is why increasingly I understand, I read the newspapers, I see that people talk about some kind of transition arrangement because there's a definite time frame associated with the Article 50 withdrawal, which is 2 years from the time the UK introduced the application, which is last March. That takes us to March 2019. And it's highly unlikely that even if we started now that we would finish a free trade agreement in that time frame. We won't start now because we have to do some other stuff first. So I think some bridging or transitional arrangements are going to have to be put in place. Now, what they will be and how that will function will be obviously the subject of the discussions.
Robert Schroeder with International Investor. It wouldn't be any fun if we didn't try to get you in a little trouble, Ambassador. You know, trade can be a serious business in several respects. One is there can be a lot of benefits for the economy, perhaps producing jobs, but there's some downside risks too. Among them, because of the sheer volume of trade, we can't inspect everything. So you could see a facilitation of such things as illicit trade, money laundering, even human trafficking, counterfeit goods, etc., and of course terrorism and some of the things that it can bring. Now, those require public expenditures. Usually the taxpayers bear the cost of trying to address those issues. So while the benefits of trade can be for the private sector, it's often the taxpayers that address the risks and the downsides of trade. Here's my question. How important is it, you mentioned Canada, you mentioned China today. How important is it to trust your trading partners?
I think it was Lenin who said, trust is good, check is better. No, look, it's obvious that when you are trading between like-minded partners with similar systems, democratic, rule of law-based systems like a partner like Canada, the level of trust is extremely high. And the level of the ability to, we know that on issues such as you mentioned, which are, by the way, I mean, I'm not entirely sure what's the link between trade and terrorism, but still, I take your point. But these are issues on which we need international cooperation anyway. And trading less will not make those problems go away. So I think that trust is important. But I also think, to your point about that the private sector gains and the taxpayer pays, well, that's why the private sector also has to pay taxes. And that's why, that's why I say that the real debate about globalization is the public policy response to that, and who pays for that. And if indeed business is able to make a lot of money out of trade, which is a good thing because it's wealth creation. But I'm personally, I mean, I suppose I'm a sort of European social democrat. You forgive me, I hope I can get out of the room now after having said that. You know, my belief is you have a strong market economy which enables wealth to be created, and you have a system that taxes that wealth in order to deliver the social goods that you need, whether that's healthcare, whether that's education, or whether that is the flanking measures to deal with some of the problems you've mentioned. Now, the balance between that is a debate. Even within Europe, we have different models of countries that tax very high and countries that tax a bit less, countries that deliver a lot through public sector, countries that deliver a bit less. So that's still a choice that we believe our individual member states should be allowed to make. But the fundamental issue is there. And I think, so I've always defended trade on the grounds that it creates additional wealth, but I've always said what you do with that wealth and to whom it accrues and to what purpose it is put is of course a matter of public policy. And that's where you get issues like money laundering or tax evasion, which as you know is a very topical issue these days. And on this, I think the European Union has been in the forefront of leading international efforts to address those issues as part of understanding that that the more we have international interaction and trade and commerce, the more that other things get internationalized, and then you have to respond to that. And with China, by the way, I mean, let's be honest, we don't actually have a trade agreement with China. We don't have a trade agreement, so we trade under WTO rules. We were very pleased to see China enter the WTO. And I must say, my experience from my Geneva days is that by and large, China has actually been a fairly good corporate WTO citizen. Now, I'm not giving them, you know, a clear grade of, you know, everything's fine. We have issues. We've discussed in response to the previous question some of those issues. But by and large, they have lived up to the commitments that they have taken, which are, of course, WTO commitments. They're not the same as a comprehensive trade deal. When you're trading in WTO rules, you have to respect those rules, but they don't cover everything. And then you have to fall back on a bilateral approach to decide how you react to problems you may have with a specific trading partner.
And the last question.
Thank you. Thanks,
go.
Ambassador.
Okay.
Megan Casella with Politico. I wanted to ask,
sorry.
you had mentioned Section 232 concerns about the ongoing investigations under Section 232. I wondered if you could just generally elaborate a bit on those concerns. Are you worried that if they do decide to move forward with action that could, you know, serve as, allow other nations to use Section 232 in the name of national security as a fig leaf for protectionism? Do you foresee retaliatory backlash, that sort of thing? Thanks.
Well, I mean, our concerns, I think, are twofold. I mean, we are a bit worried about the use of the national security measure for what may or may not be a national security issue, but which could be perceived as being an issue rather of economic impact of imports. I think we have to be very careful in protecting the national security space for when we really need it, the issue of sanctions or other issues where we feel threatened in national security and need to take exceptional measures. So I think broadening that application to situations which are rather more economic in nature has risks, and we would be concerned about that. We're also concerned about the extent to which this may or may not impact on European exports, whatever is finally proposed, we don't know. Because we would find it quite amazing that exports of a product from Europe, from NATO allies, could ever be considered in some way incompatible with America's national security interests. But we wait to see what comes out of the report and what is recommended and what action, if any, the administration decides to take. But we have those concerns.
And the ambassador, Jim. Okay, that's the last question.
Yeah, I can't not let Jim ask a question. He turns up to my every speech.
At the end, sorry. Jim Berger, Washington Trade Daily. Mr. Lighthizer yesterday made it pretty clear it was the European Union holding up a restart to the TTIP talks, not the United States. When these talks start, which he said they would in the fall, when these talks start, will they start from a blank sheet of paper, or where they left off, or what would Brussels prefer?
I must admit, I didn't quite take from the ambassador's comments your observation, Jim. So I, as my press attaché told me when I first arrived here, he said, very good phrase I'm going to teach you, Ambassador, is, I don't accept the premise of your question. So I don't think, frankly, either side is holding it up. Ambassador Lighthizer has just arrived. I mean, we had a first meeting with Cecilia Malmström, and I think clearly we do need some prior discussion before we relaunch ourselves into complex negotiations in order to be sure that we're pretty much on the same page and we're clear where we think we're going and how we would get there. if and when the talks restart, I sincerely hope we're not going to throw away 3.5 years of work. Of course, as in any trade negotiation, nothing is agreed until everything is agreed, so any of that can be revisited. I mean, what we've agreed with the previous administration does not bind this administration, so I suppose they would want to have a look at the whole thing. But I mean, I think an enormous amount of good work was done, and as you know well, I would say 85% of a trade negotiation is not particularly controversial. It's about getting stuff down on paper that needs to be there, but it's not really contentious. And we'd only just begun to discuss some of the what we call the end game issues, which are the really difficult, politically difficult and controversial issues. So I think there's plenty of scope for this administration to put its full stamp on these negotiations, and we understand fully that that's what they would wish to do. So I hope we will build on what is there, but of course in the end everything is open to being revisited.
Right. Well, with that, thank you very much, Ambassador, and if you can help me thanking him. Thank you.